Our panelists today, minus Falastin Dwaikat, who would have been in that seat, we would have probably given her a comfortable seat. Our panelists today are Camille, a Palestinian community activist in Chicago, co-founder of the Union of Palestinian Women's Associations. Thank you. Coya White Hat-Artichoker, a member of the Rosebud Sioux tribe, whose organizing focuses on two-spirit and queer issues. And Reverend Erica Williams, who I believe flew in today from North Carolina, yesterday from the hurricane-ravaged North Carolina. Thank you. Our thoughts are with you and your family. And Reverend Williams' ministry lies at the liberation of the poor and dispossessed around the world. Okay. Moving. This is a very heavy political moment. Many of us, most women, most gender non-conforming individuals, are reliving our trauma because of the national spectacle of the Kavanaugh nomination. Speaking about her coming forward and detailing her assault, again, reliving it, Dr. Christine Blasey Ford said, and I quote, "I was wondering whether I would just be jumping in front of a train that was headed to where it was headed anyway, and that I would just be personally annihilated." That train, of course, is the train moving Brett Kavanaugh's career forward, from prep school to the Supreme Court. I'll repeat her words. "I was wondering whether I would just be jumping in front of a train that was headed to where it was headed anyway, and that I would just be personally annihilated." Too many of us know the feeling, the speeding train of patriarchy, patriarchal entitlement, patriarchal violence. It seems unstoppable. What the Me Too movement has shown is that it is pervasive. Millions and millions upon more millions of women and gender non-conforming people have not just one, but multiple experiences of assault. Me Too is a movement. Me Too is a book where every single page, every single story is of violence. The entire book, not some passages, comes with a trigger warning. And while there is comfort in knowing we are not alone, there's also something utterly devastating in the realization of how pervasive patriarchal violence is, has been, and hopefully will stop being. We must turn Me Too into the train. We must not imagine that if enough of us throw ourselves on the track, the train will stop. The train has been going over our bodies for a very long time. Too many of us have been annihilated as the train crushed us, speeding towards its destination, from prep school to the Supreme Court, from prep school to the presidency. We must turn Me Too into that train and change its direction. If there are to be victims on the tracks, let those victims be those engaging in and upholding the systems of oppression. We'll be merciful. We will let those who change their ways get on board as we head in a new direction. We do not want to become oppressors, but we insist on liberation, decolonization, self-determination. And liberation, decolonization, self-determination hinge on overthrowing the systems of oppression in their multiple facets, from prep school to the presidency, from prep school to the Supreme Court, of this settler colonial country, of all settler colonial countries. Some of you might, I hope not too many of you, but some of you might wonder how settler colonialism is sexual violence. We're going to be talking about that, right? Mm-hmm. And, just hinting at the tip of the iceberg, think of the rape that is always, always, always part of conquest. Think of the sexual violence that is always, always, always part and parcel of hypermilitarism. We don't need to get into details. I will outside if you want to talk about how colonialism is sexualized violence, racialized violence. Just think of, the disproportionate murder of indigenous women. Think of the violence against black women's bodies. Think of Palestinian women being considered the mothers of snakes and Palestinians being considered a demographic threat and women delivering at checkpoints. That is the sexualized, racialized violence of settler colonialism, of oppressive systems. And speaking of oppression, I want to address something that I heard this morning as one of the speakers declared Israel the longest-lived racist colonial regime in modern history. I have to disagree. The 500+ years of colonialism on Turtle Continent are a longer racist colonial regime. And let's make no mistake about it, that colonialism is not over. When this country celebrates Independence Day in July, it is not Indigenous Independence Day we are celebrating. It is the independence of the colonizers from their former colonial master. We cannot, as Palestinians, some of us do, we cannot, should not engage in oppression Olympics. Palestinians do not get the gold medal. Nor do I want anyone to get the gold medal, because you cannot win at Oppression Olympics. You can only lose. You can only be the bigger loser. We're not here to lose. On the other hand, we must look at how we come together to shift from a discourse of Oppression Olympics to joint decolonial struggle. The same kind of shift we are witnessing in the Me Too movement, from survivor to smasher of patriarchy. Me Too is also time's up. This panel brings together survivors of settler colonialism with all the sexualized, racialized violence inherent in settler colonialism to discuss how our struggles interconnect and how together we rise. In the violent patriarchal world we live in, we come together because our freedom is interconnected in inseparable ways. We believe each other. We also have to see each other. And when we see each other, really see each other, really get to talk about each other's experiences, really get to know each other, this is how we realize that we are in the struggle together. So, rather than, my vision was that rather than ask the panelists to give a short speech each, I'm going to just ask questions. We're going to engage in a discussion. I have 3 questions for the panelists to start us off the discussion. And then I will be taking the questions that hopefully you would have asked. I have my browser and I will be seeing your questions. And then I'm going to save the last 15 minutes with Becca helping me with the time card. Wherever Becca is, I'll have the time card. And, oh, it's Rama. All right. and we save the last 15 minutes or so for our own concluding remarks. Again, I'm trying to make sure that we get a chance to engage in a discussion. You get a chance to ask questions. We get a chance to make concluding remarks. Is that okay with everyone? All right, so our first question, would everyone offer a brief definition of your understanding of intersectional feminism? And please hold the mic to your mouth as you speak. Yeah, go ahead. Mike, a brief definition of intersectional feminism.
That was amazing, thank you. I was like, oh, so it's gonna be like that. Okay. Chante washte nape chiusape mialo tachega washte wi. I just introduced myself in my traditional Lakota language, as I have been asked to do by my elders when I do any sort of public speaking thing. And what I said to you was, I extend a handshake from my heart to you. And I also told you my name in Lakota, which is Good Cattle Woman. And the reason we do that is that it, in our traditional societies, we tell you our names because it places us in the community, and so then you know who to go to like hold me responsible if I get out of line. So I think I just want to say I'm really grateful to be here. I've been very excited about this opportunity, this panel, and this discussion, and it's really great to meet these women here. We have been on an long email thread together, and I'm very sorry that our panelist from Palestine could not join us. It's very upsetting that occurred. So a brief definition of intersectional feminism. Here we go. So I think that, to place the context, I grew up in South Dakota on the Rosebud Reservation. My mother was a feminist. My aunts were feminist. One of my aunts started the first domestic violence shelter on a reservation in the country. And so I grew up very much being politicized and very much aware of the racism in this country. But more than that, I grew up very much understanding that domestic violence and sexual violence against Native women was not traditional, was not cultural. And it was made very clear to me that that was introduced to our communities when white people came to our shores. And so they brought to that with them sexism, racism, subjugation of women, homophobia, all of it. And that's not to say that our societies didn't have issues, but to have learned from my elders and my community that our women were respected and had a voice in our societies, and that if a woman wanted to divorce her partner, man, all she had to do was put his moccasins outside the teepee, and that's all he left with. She kept everything. So true story, right? Wouldn't it be great if we could just do that with other people? Just like, we're done. Here's your shoes. Bye. So I think for me, a lot of when I think of intersectional feminism, I think a lot about what does it mean to hold multiple identities in multiple spaces and to have sort of a multidimensional thinking. And so part of how I approach that in part of the work that I have done is to do really cultural reclamation work, right? And to go back to what are our traditional ways of thinking and how much that influences what that means to me about what are the things that I should care about, right? And so I talk, I have several family members who are at Standing Rock, and I talk about Standing Rock a lot. I was at Standing Rock, and part of what struck me so much about Standing Rock was, one, it was the largest gathering of Native people in centuries, right? It was amazing. But the other part was I really loved that we talked about being water protectors. We were not protesters. And it was because we understood that what you do to the land, you do to yourself. But it was also because we understood that should that water get poisoned, it wasn't just that direct community, it was going to go all the way down the river. It was about caring about everyone along that river, right? And so I think when I grew up being told time and again, you have to think about what are the next 7 generations. That your time here is really very limited, but what are we leaving for our children? What are we what are we building towards? And so I think for me, intersectional feminism means that I'm thinking about all of you. I'm thinking about your children. I'm thinking about our collective future. That's what's on my mind, right? So that to me is what intersectional feminism is. And it is So I think, we need to work on fighting colonization and imperialism. And I have a very special affinity in my heart for the Palestinian struggle, because I see it as very much a similar struggle to Native folks in this country. And I know that the strategy that has been used in Palestine was taken from the strategy that was used against my people. And that's why I'm here, because all of that matters to me.
Peace and love to each of you. When I show up on the scene, I always make it very clear that I don't show up by myself. I show up with a group of ancestors that came before me, that recognized that liberation was for all of us that were oppressed and marginalized. One of those key sheroes was my grandmother, who anytime I speak, I say her name, Miss Willie G. Morris, who was a woman who didn't have much, but she believed that whatever she had, she used it for the sake of others. And so I stand strong today because of her. She passed away 2 years ago, but her spirit lives right on through me. And I am so grateful for the spirit that she instilled in me. Because of her, I recognize that the world is all of us. We're connected to each other. And that if I'm fighting for the liberation of not just Black people, it's including all of us. And so I hail from the state of Michigan. I come from Saginaw, Michigan, which is right next door to Flint, Michigan. And so people always talk about the Flint water crisis, and they talk about how the water was a major issue there in Flint. But a lot of times we don't talk about that 74.4% of the people in Flint were under the poverty line. We don't talk about how the school systems in Flint were already being destroyed, the jobs were not there, and a lot of folks were living well below their deserved right to live, right needs to live. And so I come out of that context because I recognize that my home state of Michigan was just a reflection of the world at large. And I recognize that in Flint, Michigan, that there were a lot of women there, going back even to my grandmother, who were not seen, who were often forgotten about, and that their stories to the mainstream did not matter. And so I live under the philosophy of womanist theology. I don't know if many of you know about that, but womanist theology subscribes to that we all matter, and that the voices of women of color, and not just women of color, but their stories are to be shared and to be heard. And so through that narrative, I said that there had to be some kind of learning or structure that I had to figure out about the Palestinian people, because I am an ordained reverend in the Christian church. And the Jesus that I serve was a Palestinian Jew. And so I serve also as a national organizer for the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for more revival. And I'm not here today to promote the campaign, but I'm here to tell you about the ministry in which I live. And out of organizing with the Poor People's Campaign, seeing the systemic racism in this country, seeing the poverty, seeing the ecological devastation, seeing our war economy and militarism, and our nation's distorted moral narrative, after we finished 40 days of progressive work in this nation to change the narrative in this nation for 140 million people who, again, as I said earlier, are often forgotten, stories are not listened to, I said, I got to go to Palestine and see what's going on over here with my sisters and brothers. And I took every dollar that I had, and I said, I'm going to Palestine, and I went this summer in July, and when I got there, y'all, I was furious. Because everything that I see in Flint, Michigan, I see in Saginaw, Michigan, and I even see in Raleigh, North Carolina, where I live right now, is the exact same things I see in Palestine. So as my grandmother would say, the game don't change, just the players. And so the history that we've been seeing all across this country and across the world is still here. And so I said, I got to do like the ancestors that came before me did. I got to do something about it. I got to come together with the people who are living these injustices daily and say, y'all, how do we figure this thing out? Because we can't leave this world the way we found it before we inherited it. And so that's what I think interpersonal feminism is making sure that we see each other against all of the isms that seek to divide us, because at the end of the day, there's one enemy. There's one enemy that seeks to divide all of us and tear us apart, because at the end of the day, if we all come together under the under the cause of love and justice and peace, we'll tear this world up. Because this world was created, I believe, by God for all children to be able to have a fair life, to be able to have the things that they deserve, which is housing, which is to have food, to have those basic necessities as Dr. King used to talk about. And so that is what I believe that we are called to do as our feminism, not just to talk about it, but to see each other across all those isms, race, class, sexism, all of those things, because at the end of the day, we are united. And we are one people, and we deserve everything, we deserve everything that each person on this earth should have.
Thank you, my sister. Assalamu alaikum. And thank you. And good evening, and thank you, sisters. I'm so honored to be here among this panel and honored to be here at this conference. Oh, sorry. I'm so honored to be here at this conference and so inspired to be here. And I want to give a shout out to all, especially, I'm proud that this is an intergenerational convening, but I also want to just give a shout out to the young people that are here. I attended some of the workshops. I attended the workshops today, and they were just, the young people were amazing. So that gives us the hope and the optimism for the future. I was asked to, when we were asked to define what these different terms mean, it's different. Sometimes, we have the practice and we do the work, but we don't have the language of academia. That's right. And so some of us struggled with some of these terms when they say, define a certain term.
Define intersectional feminism.
Exactly. So I was thinking about it. I thought, well, isn't that what we used to call the isms in terms of how we defined our struggles? So for me today, being here, I feel is full circle. Because in the 70s, I moved to Lebanon, and I worked in the refugee camps there. And at that time, and I was thinking about it this morning when Jihad was talking about Gaza, because at the time when I went there, it was the Tel Zatar massacre. And I'm thinking, in my mind, all the different events that our peoples have been through, not only in Palestine and Lebanon, but also here in the United States, our African-American brothers and sisters, our Native American brothers and sisters, our Latino, and all the immigrants who become dehumanized when they're trying to cross these borders in order to just survive and have dignity in their lives. But long story short, as I was thinking about intersectionality, most of us women who started this work, especially from the region of the Middle East, we faced colonialism during those times. French, English, then the occupation. And so it was the national and colonial issue that really brought us into the national movement. And it's the same case with people of color in the United States, I think. Racism brings you first as an entree into the movement work. And that's something that as time goes on, we begin to understand and see that the national aspiration is so important in terms of self-determination and sovereignty. But if you are not accepted as a full participant in that movement because you are a woman, you start understanding the impact of patriarchy on us as women and as society. And it moves on. We begin then to understand what militarism is or what economic oppression is, and make the connection between the different oppressions. And so it's sexism, it's heteropatriarchy. That's something new in our language in terms of identifying this as an oppression that our communities face. So the intersection of all of these oppressions becomes something that's connected to a worldview. And when we develop a worldview and an analysis that understands the different systems and how it dominates and oppresses and marginalizes our communities and our peoples. And when we develop this worldview, we're able then to use this analysis as a tool to build our movement and to identify who is oppressing us. And I think that's the first step, identifying where the injustice is so that you can identify what the justice is that you want. So we'll move on to the next question.
Thank you.
I mean, I do have other things to say, but as...
Well, this promises to be fabulous. All right. Okay, my second question. I'm going to grab the other mic. I got a mic all to myself. Okay. This is working, right. So, oppressed communities, and we come from oppressed communities frequently look within, focusing on our own challenges within our own communities. How can we, each one of us, or as a collective, how can we bring other disenfranchised communities' issues into our own? How can we have those discussions about other communities that are disenfranchised, dispossessed, unsettled? I like to say unsettled rather than settled. Whoever, yeah.
So I'll continue on what I was saying earlier in terms of how do we connect communities?
Yes.
That was the question. First, we have to build our own community, and we have to understand who we are and what our issues are. When we're able to educate and build our own communities, then we'll be able to connect with other communities. I think in the case of women organizing, I think that has been really key in terms of how women have organized across the generations, especially in the case of Palestinian and Arab women. I can speak to this. But there have been many spaces where women have taken the lead in terms of either reacting to situations and organizing their communities. And with this, they've understood, as I said before, the oppressions that they are facing. Once we understand the different oppressions that are marginalizing us, then we're able to make those connections because we aspire for change and transformation. And when you aspire for change and transformation, you see that you need to bring all the players that agree with you so that they can join you in this effort for change and transformation. So once again, the analysis is key. And analysis is the tool that we have to focus more on in terms of educating one another and educating our communities so that we can create the new future that we want to see happen. This can't happen if we stay also, at the same time, we cannot stay insular in terms of our organizing. We have to step out of our own boundaries because if we, there's a South African saying, Mbutu, our struggle is connected to one another, and help me somebody with it. I am because of you. I am because of you. And our struggle and our destiny is connected in one. And so once we have this vision that I am because of you, then we begin to work together so that we can create the change and transformation that we need to see happen and the liberation for our peoples.
And I would agree with you. I would just add to that. I think one of the biggest things we must do is to take a step back and then just try to engage people and listen. That was my whole goal when I went to Palestine this summer. And I want to give a huge shout out to my sister Sandra Tamari, who, she is amazing. She did not know me. She didn't know me, but someone reached out to her and said, hey, there's a young woman going to Palestine who just wants to go to meet people and just to learn the struggle there. And she introduced me to folks, and I was able to go in to meet with people and to hear stories. And sometimes we go into communities wanting to talk. We the experts, we know everything. But it was a time for me to go and for me to listen and to really hear how people are being deeply impacted. I couldn't get that from the news. I couldn't get that from books. I got a chance to see people's lives and really to talk with them about their everyday struggles that really didn't look no different than my own struggles here in the United States. And so the biggest thing I would say in order to bring communities in is to listen and to go and to walk with people. And as you said, Rayma, to see people. So many times we go also to those places and it's like, we want to, I can only speak for sometimes in our generation, we want to tweet, we want to text and do all those things, but how can we just go and just be fully present? And to really take people's stories into our lives. I'm telling y'all, when I left Palestine, I knew right then and there, I was like, I don't really know much about this, but I know one thing for sure, that this will be a fight for the rest of my life. And I am committed to learning more about the struggle in Palestine, to be educated, and as Reverend Barbara always say, not to be loud and wrong. And not to be out here talking about something that I really don't know about. But to really humble myself to learn and to grow. And so that's how we can bring communities in, by being there, seeing and showing up and listening, but also by whatever way we can to be educated. You know what I mean? Like, political education is so key. And I'm grateful for this conference because, y'all, I'm learning from y'all. I just had a recent workshop I was just in, and they were talking about the fragmentation within the Palestinian community. It was powerful. Because the same issues that they're dealing with in the Palestinian community, we deal with in the African American community. And so it's just good to hear how we're all being colonized and how things are happening. But it's like, at the end of the day, we don't let that stop us from building our communities, but also building together, but walking together, learning from one another, and not trying to outshine one another, or as you said, doing oppression Olympics, but recognizing we are all in this struggle together. And that all of our liberation, I know we say it is cliche, but it's real. Our liberation is connected to one another, and how do we figure out how best to work with one another? Because that is the key. Working together. What I've noticed in this Poor People's Campaign as we travel around this country, it's so hard sometimes for folks to just allow for things to happen, and not some people feeling like they got to lead everything and they got to be in charge. But understanding that we have to come together to reason together to figure out how best to do this work together.
Yeah, I'm like, I don't know what else to say. It just reminds me of like my own personal experience. As we've been talking, I'm sitting here reflecting on the idea that, like, I think I was 22 years old before I met a Palestinian person. And I remember being like, oh, okay. And thinking that, like, because I had grown up with so many, or had a lot of influential folks in my life who were Jewish, that I had sort of been, I had not questioned what I had been told about the conflict, right? I didn't have any questions about it. And then I met my friend Sammer, and I remember just like, I don't remember how it started, but he was talking to me about something, he was worried about his family, and I was like, oh, what's going on? And he started telling me things, and I was like, what are you talking about? Like, it didn't occur to me. And then he started forwarding me emails from his family in Palestine. And I started reading them, and they broke my heart. And I realized in that moment that I was so ignorant. and I hadn't questioned what had been put before me. And it was a stark realization, and it was a wake-up call to me. And I think at that point, I decided that I could no longer just accept everything at face value. And that what I had to do was that even though I was out of college now, I had to take on my own political education. So what you just said, exactly. So I have made it my life's goal to understand what are the struggles of other communities. Because solidarity is a very important word. Like, true solidarity means dedication, right? It means that you go and you learn and you ask questions and you don't accept what people who are empowered tell you, right? Because they are in power and they want to preserve their power. And so I feel like that's the thing, is that like, and similarly, you know, I have done a lot of work around immigration issues and talking about what does it mean to be indigenous to this continent, right? And when we look at this whole immigration debate and people are like, these illegal aliens, and it makes me so mad. And so I'm like, these borders are false. They are so false. And how dare you question whether or not indigenous people get to come and cross our lands that we have crossed for millennia. So it just bugs me so much. And it reminded me of Ubuntu, it reminded me of the Mayan saying in Lakesh, you are the other me, right? And so I think of that all the time, is how would I want somebody to come to me to understand the struggle of my people? What would I hope that they would learn? And how do we be patient and compassionate with each other when we're asking questions because we really don't know? Right? So I think that's the other element, solidarity, but I also think we have to have a little patience for people who are genuinely ignorant. My little sister was in an airport and this guy was asking her all these weird questions about being Native, and later my mom and her were talking about it, and she was genuinely baffled that people had not actually really believed that like maybe we still live in teepees, or, I mean, we have teepees, but we don't, whatever. But you know, so I just think that we really have to dedicate ourselves to really doing our own political education so that we can stand in true solidarity with people.
And so you made me think of another thing, and so this goes back even to the core of I feel like the reason why I do, and I know this is what I do, I'm so committed to loving my neighbor as myself. And I know that sounds cliche, I know we say it a lot of times, but just really think, I want everybody in this room just to really think, like, do I love my neighbor as myself? Like, do I love my neighbor as myself? Like when I was in Palestine and I was sitting there and I was having conversations with folks, and I kept thinking, like, what if these were my children? What if this was my mama that's in a refugee camp? What if this is my community? And I kept saying, like, how would I want it to be for myself? And so I think, you know, sometimes we think real deep about stuff. We got all these theories and all these philosophies, but at the very core, how do we love our neighbors as ourselves? And that ain't even just a Christian principle, that's universal. How do we love our neighbors as ourselves? And when you begin to think about how I love my neighbor as myself, you become dedicated to the cause that I will give what I can for my neighbor. I will sacrifice even for myself to the limit of making sure that the person that's next to me can have. And I know some of you may say, well, who is my neighbor? Any person that you come in contact, and it don't even have to be who you come in contact with. I believe all of you sitting in this room today are here because you love the Palestinian people. And so we have to begin to just think with the lens of how do we operate in these spaces and how do we do the work with the goal in mind of love. And some of the issues that we have and all of the mess and chaos that we have, sometimes that can be pushed aside if we go from the basis of loving one another and seeing one another and showing up from one another in a pure place of I love you and I really want what's best for you. Even if it causes me not to get any recognition or anything, it is because I want to see you have the best things in life and you be your best self. Sorry about that. That was just, I wanted to add that. But I operate from that place of love. And I believe if we was to love each other more in this world, some of these very issues we have, you all, would not be in play. But we say love a lot of times, but do we really mean it?
Not working, is it? Okay.
So I agree with you, my sister, that that's something that we need to really work on and practice, that we be steeped in the ethics of love, an ethic of caring for one another, an ethic and core values where we'll build these bonds and fight for one another's cause. Just like you love the cause of Palestine, I love the cause of African Americans and Native Americans and Latinos, and am ready to stand up and to stand up and sacrifice for these issues. And I think that's something across the board here that we want to build so it'll be part of our values continuously. All Black lives do matter. And so we all will stand up for Black lives so that we can practice exactly what we're talking about. I want to also just add to this in terms of this notion of building community across all the different transnational, state, cultural, whatever lines there are, whatever barriers there are between us, that we need to also understand what are the structures that we're trying to change. Who are the state actors that we're trying to change? Who are the individuals that we're trying to change? When we have this type of vision about what we're trying to do, then this notion of intersectionality, or this concept of intersectionality, becomes much easier for us because we understand all the systems and their interconnectedness. When we understand all the systems and their interconnectedness, then we'll be able to work in order to work for freedom and for justice and for liberation.
Thank you. So I'm going to also jump in and say, I mean, obviously, Reverend Williams, you said your grandma said the game doesn't change, only the players. I think we're talking about changing the game. And this is what feminism does. It changes the game. It's like, you know, when I was thinking of the vision of the train that has annihilated so many of us, and I said we must become the train. And that train is going to be a different one, moving in a different direction. The game that has been played by different players, each one of them oppressing us in similar ways, because that's how the game is played, whoever comes down. We're also changing the game, and I think that's what feminism is about. It's not, we don't, as Winona LaDuke said it many long years ago, we don't want a bigger piece of the pie. We want a different pie. We want different ingredients. And I think the feminist vision, intersectional feminist vision, non-Zionist vision, not the Zionist movement, not Hillary Clinton's idea of feminism, not white liberal imperialist feminism, but genuine intersectional feminism does not want a bigger piece of the pie. It wants a different pie made with different ingredients, the primary ingredient being love, right? Yeah, okay. So, my next question to you is, as feminists, what are some of the challenges we encounter within our activist communities? For example, and I can just list a few examples, the demand to prioritize the struggle, the national struggle, or the race struggle over gender issues, or sometimes the hypervisibility of male victimhood, the hypervisibility of male leadership, homophobia, transphobia, general power dynamics that reproduce within our communities, the general power dynamics that we see in greater society at a time when we obviously have a very, very, very clear idea what those general power dynamics are. What are some of these challenges that we encounter, and how are we engaging with them, responding to them, trying to change them, I guess?
I think that one of the harder things that happens is how do we sort of, okay, sorry. My brain is going all over the place. One of the things that when my mother was doing work on domestic violence and my aunts were doing work was they were also really clear that they needed to do work with men. and that it wasn't something where we all know in our communities, like, people don't leave, like, you can't just kick people out, right? So how do we create accountabilities for each other, and how do we create ways to bring, two of my cousins have an organization called Wicha Agli, and it translates to calling men back to themselves, right? So how do we create ways where we help each other to come out of really terrible patterns, right? How do we have those hard conversations with each other? How do we create accountability? How do we make it safe for people to feel like they can change, right? Because, and I think that's the difference between the call out and the call in, right? And I'll be the first one to be like, no, if you piss me off, like, get the fuck, go, right? But I really recognize that, like, that actually doesn't work for us, because we send people off to other communities where they're harmful there too, right? And if we want to build communities and societies where we all feel safe, we have got to figure out a way how to, like, create those mechanisms, right? And I say this because I think about toxic masculinity a lot. And I think in activist communities, oftentimes we let far too many men get away with it. Like, I know of one person here locally who's like group to group to group to group to group to group, and at some point I'm like, when does this stop, right? How do we stop this? And part of it is, so I think that's what weighs on my mind, is this idea of, like, how, I don't know, I'm just gonna say this, I feel like we have to talk about the fact that half of the population in this country is waging war on the other half. Men in this country are waging war on women, and we have to figure out how we can push back on that. And I think the Kavanaugh hearings, I don't know about you all, but, like, I have been triggered for days. It has been hard, I am exhausted, and I wasn't even in that room, but it just really brings home for me the real clarity around, like, and I will say it, that it is like white, male, cisgendered masculinity that is really toxic, and we are all suffering for it. And so we have to figure out a way to start to, like, be honest about the fact that there is a war on women, and that we have got to figure out how to put a stop to it. And I don't know what that looks like for women. I was, like, asking myself yesterday, do I need to get on a plane and go to DC? Like, is it enough that we do rallies in our own cities, or do we have to go to, like, where the current power lies? I don't know the answer, but I know that we have to do something, and it's getting worse, and we can't afford to sit and just wait and see what happens anymore. We have to act, we have to resist, we have to fight.
And so I would say, as a Black woman who is queer, and I say that proudly because I know even in my faith tradition, oftentimes I'm shunned because of that, because that's a whole different conversation, but I'm proudly proclaim that. And I say that in a lot of even movement spaces, my voice is often silenced. And there are times that I go in spaces, and as an African American woman, sometimes I feel like my opinion is not validated, or I'm tokenized. And so I think, that's a part of where I struggled even with the women's movement here in the U.S. Because I felt like, we marched and we did a lot of things, and I'm connected to a lot of the organizers that are part of that, but I felt like in some spaces, women of color voices were not always at the table. And we know there's some history with that, even how the organizers came about, that 3 women of color actually ended up becoming organizers of that women's march after the fact of an outrage of that women of color were not at the table. Let's be honest. And even during that process of the women's march, I often struggle still with that march because poor women are often forgotten about in that conversation. And so that's where I hold up the banner, because I'm often like, I know that women of color are forgotten, but larger than that, women who are already forgotten about in society, who are poor and dispossessed, are often marginalized in movement spaces. And so that, to me, just really, it infuriates me, because I'm like, at the end of the day, there are more poor women right here in the United States. The largest demographic of poor folks in this country are white women. There are 64 million poor whites in this country. How many, do you know the number for the women? What is it? Yeah, well, it's 48 million. And so that lets you understand, lets you see, that poor folks, their narratives are often forgotten about. So it's not even just women of color, also poor white women and other women, their stories are often forgotten. And so I just want to be very clear that when we have these conversations and dialogues, that we keep at the forefront women that are poor, because class is sometimes forgotten in this conversation. And even around the world, we forget about that we have global capitalism. That is our big enemy. That is our enemy. And it don't care what color you are, don't care what gender you are. I mean, that's an issue. Don't get me wrong. They divide us on that. But at the end of the day, capitalism is the rule. That's the issue. And so I just often always have to bring that up. It's like, at the end of the day, we have to discuss that issue of classism, because it seeks to keep us all oppressed, and it's a major issue.
I want to add one more thing, because this also really struck me this week, is that we need to talk to the white people in our life, because they need to go talk to the white folks in this country. And I think that came up to me. I thought of that really specifically because of the 53% of white women who voted for Trump. Yep. And I saw that all those women sitting behind Judge Kavanaugh. And I love a good white ally, and it's great that you want to hang out with me and party and let's be homies. But honestly, I need white folks to get out in their communities and have conversations with other white people about what is going on. It really bothers me. I'm like, don't spend your time with me. Like, great, you're down, you're solid. Go get your people, please.
Well, lots been said about this issue, but I want to just bring it a little bit back to what my experience has been around this issue, challenges facing our community. That was the question, right?
Yes, within our own community.
Within our own
community. Gender issues and problematic gender issues within our own communities. Right.
So, I think we have something that we call the politics of patriarchy, political patriarchy, and it just influences everything that happens, whether we like it or not. And this is something that rules globally, not only in our part of the world, but globally. And I think this is something that we were talking about just now. And so in many cases, in the case of Palestinian women, I think that the Palestinian and Arab women have carried the movements over the years. To be frank with you, when the wars break out, it is the women who are there organizing, providing relief, taking care of the family, taking care of the refugees. Not women alone, but the backbone, I could say, of the national and social movements have been the women who have provided so much care and support and service and love and organizing and even militancy. So this role has been very important that women have taken on. And if we analyze in terms of the amount of work and struggle that Arab and Palestinian women have put into the movements, whether in the indigenous countries or in the diaspora, you don't see that reflected in the leadership of the organizations that operate within our specific communities. And this is really a very important issue for us to be working on and thinking about together in alliance with progressive males, an alliance with progressive people who are from different sexual orientations, so that we can together figure out how we can transform our organizations and our leadership so that there's equity and representation from all sectors of our community. So I think that this is an important issue for us to be thinking about. I think the other issue that we should be frank about is the issue of are we really embracing members of our community from different sexual orientations within our movement and within our leadership? This is a big question for us and an important question for us because I said earlier, when we entered into the movement, it was the national question that brought most of us in there. The race question, the national self-determination question, and our awareness grew over time, women's rights, and it went hand in hand globally. I mean, there were struggles where Western feminists did not accept Palestinian feminists because of the question of Palestine, and this is a political issue. And we struggled so that we could be within these different progressive arenas, political arenas. But the point here is that, now I'm gonna forget my point. Because I was thinking, I read one of your articles about Nairobi, and when Nawal Sardawi was there, and I recalled, because sometimes you have to read about things to remember what you did. I remember I was at that conference in Kenya, and I remembered that we were outside protesting because the Western feminists did not want Nawal Sardawi to participate in the conference because she was talking about Palestine at the time.
Yeah, she was told. So Betty Friedan, it was Betty Friedan who told Nawal Saadawi at a conference, please don't bring up Palestine at this conference. Palestine is a political issue, not a women's issue.
Say it again, she said. Oh, yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead now. Finish.
But I would also just challenge each of us in this room to how many of us, when we think about the struggles in the U.S. or even around the world, can name, and we may name one or two or three, but name a lot of the women who are leading the movement. Here in the U.S., we always romanticize the civil rights movement, and the first things we say is Dr. King, and we say all these other folks, but what are all the unsung heroes, or sheroes, I would say, that led that movement? You know what I mean? You got your Fannie Lou Hamers. You got your Ella Bakers. You got women who made some just amazing strides in the movement. And so I would challenge us in this room as we leave here today, let us start thinking of all these women, the women that are leading these efforts, and we speak their names. We always have this saying is, we can't change the narrative until we change the narrators. And so we need to start telling who the narrators are in our communities and sharing the names of women who may not be the front line or be in our papers, but we have to share their stories and speak their names. And so I just think that's so critical because if we're going to really be walking in our feminism and really walking this walk, it's going to take the women, especially for us to share and lift other women. Because sometimes women, we can also be the very oppressor of other women. And we can fall right into the lines of patriarchy and not even being aware of it. Yeah, women can be patriarchal too. There's a lot of them, because even this very week with the whole issue with Kavanaugh, I've seen a lot of women saying that Dr. Ford shouldn't have been wearing certain clothes, or she shouldn't have put herself in a space. We've heard it. We've seen social media posts. But that's why we have to stand up and say, no woman should ever be disrespected. No matter what she wears or what she does, no means no. And no man has the right to put his hand on another woman. So it is going to take for us, even as women, to make sure we be bold and strong and stand together, to make sure we make sure the women's names are known and that we stand together in all times in this movement together.
So I just got the 10-minute time card. I was hoping to get an answer, but I also really do want us to all conclude. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read one question and have us address it briefly. Those of us who want to address it very briefly. I mean, there's a few very good questions, but obviously we don't have time for these questions, because I really do think it's important for us to conclude with everyone offering a vision of our coming together to rise together. I mean, this is the theme of the conference, coming together to rise together. So I want us to conclude with that. So keeping in mind that we are going to conclude with our concluding remarks, the one question I want to ask of the ones that have been sent in is, how could you speak to gender injustice as it relates to incarceration? Because we know about the prison, all forms of incarceration. And actually, where's that question? As it relates to all form of incarceration, and does prison abolition overlap with gender and anti-colonial struggles? Good one. Yeah, that's why I picked that one. Okay.
I mean, yes. That feels, yeah, there was a study that came out that said that Native women get stopped like 6 times more than other women in the Twin Cities, are pulled over by the police. And there's also, so I think that abolition of prisons is something that we need to look at. I think that the prison system at this point has become really, especially the for-profit prisons. Oh man, I mean, it really has become a way to just weaken our communities, to impact families, to keep families apart. And our communities have always been over-criminalized, and it doesn't stop. And I think that it's the sort of modern day form of slavery. It just is. When you use prison labor to fight fires in California, and people make like 41 cents an hour. What is this? So I think that if we have to think about like accountability and holding people accountable in ways that are about really helping people to move forward with their lives. So I that's what I have. Sorry.
I gotta let the preacher close us out. I meant that with love. And I want to seriously send all of our love, our courage, our strength, our inspiration, and our hope to all of our political prisoners. Our political prisoners who languish in prisons and stand up for freedom and justice. Think it's just important that we always remember that the people that are struggling within the prisons for freedom, for our freedoms. And so the question is, with no doubt, an issue that's important to us, that's critical to us, that ending the prison industrial complex is something that should be on the top of all of our agendas because it's connected to ending capitalism and ending the systems of oppression. So once again, we connect the issues. We can't just look at it one-dimensionally and understand the structures so that we can transform our society so it'll be a society that's free and just for every individual. And you're correct, the prison industrial complex is the new slavery of the world, not only in the United States where we have millions in prison, but in Israel, where the Israelis imprison children, men and women, and use sex as a tool of war, of oppression and assault, and that's something that we have to end.
Just real briefly, I think Michelle Alexander says it really good in The New Jim Crow. And so I hope everybody in this room has read that book. It is powerful. I mean, it's a book that changed my whole life about it. But one thing I always think about, I think restorative justice is so important. And so going back to that Palestinian Jew who I follow, whenever I read the scriptures, I never see Jesus casting anybody to jail. Jesus always wanted to restore people. Jesus always wanted to bring people back into the community and help them to see what the issues were and for people to work together. And so I think that's how we're going to continue to build community if we can, because we know that a lot of the issues that why people are incarcerated, there are systemic reasons for that. And I think that's where we have to go deeper in building our communities and knowing one another and seeing one another and figure out what's really going on. Because at the end of the day, our whole purpose is to walk together through life and not to condemn one another. But I know that it's also a form of cleansing too in our capitals, in our political, our prison system. So I just think it's very important that we start talking more in our communities about restorative justice. That needs to be on the forefront of our meetings as we work together. We need to restore and not destroy.
And I just want to also add one more point. I want to send our salutes to Palestine, who's in Nablus. It's a different type of prison that people live in. And in Gaza, who live in another type of prison where they're besieged for over 11 years. And so these prisons, they're not only the structures, the buildings, the brick and mortar, they're political prisons that are keeping people oppressed and living in horrible conditions.
Thank you. Call me tunnel vision, focused minded if you want, but I'm going to focus on the gendered aspect of incarceration and bring us back to the Me Too moment. And when I think of Me Too and prison, what I think of is that a man's greatest fear in prison, rape, is the fear that we women live with every single day of our lives. Not just in prison, in our homes, in the streets, going to work, going to school, at work, at home, at school. A man's greatest fear in prison is our fear every single day of our lives. And that's something we need to address and end.